First of all, thank you all very much for being here. We're delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about these experiences, and we hope that you'll share with us the experience of trying to relive some days that were almost impossible to explain, but the importance of which can't be misunderstood or underscored enough. Basically, what I'd like to do is just try to give you a brief introduction into my parents' lives before the start of World War II in Holland. My parents, Frank and Emily, were born in 1913, some 85 years ago, and at the age of 26 in 1939, they were in the United States. In fact, where my father was undergoing a traineeship in many major department stores like Strawbridge and Clothier and Filene's and so forth throughout the country. At that point, my mother was pregnant with me. I was born in July 1939, and my parents decided to go back to Holland to be with their families when I was born, notwithstanding the fact that war had already broken out on the Eastern Front. The Germans had conquered Austria. They had moved toward the borders of other countries, and Kristallnacht had already taken place when the Germans destroyed many Jewish synagogues, many Jewish businesses, and so forth. In Holland, their lives were very ordinary in certain respects. The Jewish people in Holland were extremely well assimilated. Holland was a country which at that time had perhaps 10 million people, now 13 million. There were approximately, let's say, 150,000 Jewish people. They were extremely well assimilated. They were able to do anything, fully integrated into society in all respects. My parents lived in a very comfortable apartment in Holland, in Amsterdam specifically. My mother's parents were engaged in the diamond business, which was a good business, and they did very well. And my father's father, who was German in fact, was engaged in trading in silk handkerchiefs. My father's mother, in turn, was Dutch. My father moved to Holland in the early 30s when things became extremely difficult in Germany, as a teenager, in fact, and he took lessons from my mother, among other things, in Dutch, and they became extremely friendly and ultimately married. They came back to Holland, which was a non-militaristic society. Holland had been neutral in World War I. The Germans did not attack or take over Holland in World War I, and therefore the Dutch people at all times assumed that nothing would happen to them and that the Germans would in fact leave them alone when World War II threatened to break out and in fact did break out. The Dutch army was insignificant, a very pacifist country, and lo and behold, on May 9th, 1940, after efforts to negotiate a takeover of Holland, the Germans invaded Holland, bombed the city of Rotterdam to pieces, broke the dikes, and took over Holland in a matter of just 5 days. I'd like to start our story then and talk about what happened in those early days when the war started.
The first 2 years of the occupation were not the worst of our time, because the Germans eventually wanted to integrate Holland into the German Reich. So they behaved quite reasonably. There was no open persecution of Jews in the street, nothing like you have seen in Schindler's List, but they started with all kind of legal ordinances that made it more and more difficult. They started that we had to registrate. Everybody had to registrate, and you would get an identity card. And the Jewish identity cards were right away stamped with a J. We got from the Dutch underground identity cards without the J, and with our own fingerprints, which was a wonderful job they did. And now you ask, why did you need an identity card? Because without identity cards, you couldn't get food. Every food item was on coupons. And every week in the papers, you would see the coupons advertised. Number 1 was for butter, number 2 for potatoes, number 3 for bread. Whatever there was available was on coupons. After that, we had to deliver our bicycles. We had to register all our jewelry and deliver it. Our bank account was closed. I lost my job, so we were without money. We couldn't use any public transportation. We couldn't go to any store. We only could go to a Jewish market that was in the open, and that only had 3 times a week during special hours that we could go and shop there. So the vice was tightened and tightened. And then in 1942, we got a letter from the German commandant that we had to report for work in Germany. And at that time, we were not aware that there were any extermination camps in Germany, and we figured we are young, we are strong, we'll go and register, and after the war we come back and pick up our life. But then we understood that from the transit camp, which was still in Holland, people would be shipped to Germany, unknown destinations, in cattle cars, and not only people that were able to work, but also children, sick people, old people, disabled people. Everybody was shipped away, and we got very suspicious, and we were thinking about going into hiding, which was not so easy. At that time, all the Dutch Jews were concentrated in Amsterdam, and we lived in our apartment with my parents, with my mother-in-law, with my sister-in-law, and her little son, and with my grandmother. And we were young, but we had to find safe spot for them. And I'll give it to you for a minute, okay?
The first thing we had to do, as you can understand, we had to take care of our son. So our son, who was 2 years old, 2.5, we actually, strangely enough, had the most confidence in friends that I knew from the University of Amsterdam. And this organization which helped us was a resistance which started in the University of Amsterdam together with the Dutch Reformed Church. They have their own department called the Vrije Universiteit. And by coincidence, the rector magnificus of this university lived next to us or close to us, and we knew him. And through a friend, we just decided to give Leo to that organization. And we didn't know where he was going, and we didn't tell them that we were going into hiding. We just said, the best thing, the safest thing, is to give you our child. And the church knew where he would be. And then we would go into hiding on our own. So we gave Leo away with 1 suitcase. And he had to be toilet trained, which was not the easiest thing to do if you're 2.5 years old. But we figure we give him the suitcase, and that's all we could do. And we didn't pay, we just gave him away. And then we had to take care of my mother, of the old people who were living in our house. And by coincidence, as life goes, we met a police a policeman in the town where my mother-in-law lived, Utrecht. And in Utrecht, this policeman told our family that he would do whatever he could to save our lives. So this policeman came to Amsterdam, picked up my grandmother, who was then 75 years old, took her to the train and put her in a hospital. Then he came back and he picked up my mother and father-in-law, found them at home in Utrecht, where they stayed, strangely enough, with a German woman who was in love with a Dutchman, and they took my parents-in-law. And my mother was the third one he picked up. She went to a pension, a kind of a boarding house, and she stayed there also with a false identification card. She came through the war. And this man, whom we always honored, this policeman, without knowing us very well, saved the lives of 17 people. And he had 19 people under him that he visited and gave the cards to. And this man saved the lives of our family.
I showed you the identity cards, and the identity cards we got from the underground. My grandmother was put in a hospital, and she was 75. When she was 77, a few years later, she died. And the woman that gave the identity card was on Social Security, and she wanted to collect a Social Security, and when she came to the office, they said, Social Security, you are dead. We have your death certificate right here. And the underground had terrific troubles in straightening that out, but eventually they did that.
Je moet de kaper doen.
One of the most difficult things, of course, for us was to give our son away without knowing where he was. Another difficulty was that if you wanted to go into hiding, you had to have money. And our bank accounts were closed. I had lost my job, and we had to have money. And I had a business friend who dealt in Oriental carpets. And I went to him and I asked Mr. Kinnabanyan, can give me some Oriental rugs which I could sell on the black market, and then I'll divide the profit with you. And without any hesitation, he was a very good Muslim. He gave those rugs to me, and within 3 months, I made enough money that I felt safe to go into hiding. And on the last day, I went to him and I said, Mr. Kinnabanyan, I'm afraid to go into the street because with this terror, I'm afraid I'll be picked up, so this is the last time you'll see me. And he said to me, let me give you a good luck token.
Okay,
and he gave me his personal prayer rug. I have to show that to you.
Don't fall.
It's up to you.
Any Muslims in the audience?
Not many hands up.
No.
The
See, this is a
hands that you
Muslim
see.
prayer rug. And Muslims, like Jewish people, are not allowed to make a graven image. They are not allowed to make a graven image. So what you see here is where the head is, and you put that rug down pointing towards east, towards Mecca and Medina, and 5 times a day you pray on that rug, and you pray to Allah. And I hope Allah is not mad at him that he saved a Jewish life, but I think this was a very good talisman for us.
That rug has been on our dining room table for all those years that we are in America. I would like to tell you something, because we had been unable to save my sister. My sister's husband was working for the illegal paper when the war started. My sister's husband, my brother-in-law, had to join the Queen of Holland to go to London. And so my sister was picked up by one of the most infamous SS men you can imagine, picked up with 3 small children. And she was taken to a concentration camp that you probably also know. It's Bergen-Belsen, the concentration camp where Anne Frank and her sister died. But my sister lived there in a bunk bed, and she was with her son in the top floor. Under her was a bunk bed with her 2 girls, and she was able to work. She worked for a company that belonged to Bergen-Belsen, and they split Formica. The price she got was 1 bread a day. She gave the bread to her children, and I think maybe that is the reason why she survived, because she survived Bergen-Belsen, and they came to a train that was supposed to go to Auschwitz, but the war was over at that time. It was 1945. So in April, they stopped the train. Hitler had committed suicide on April 20th. And so she got out of the train, and she was saved by the Russians and later by the Americans, who took her in an ambulance to Holland with her children. So after the war, we got her back. But during the war, this was my great sorrow and anxiety, and we talked to each other that we wouldn't even mention her. When we were going into hiding, we were also worried about a cousin of mine to whom we were very close. And he was a messenger for the Jewish Council. And the Jewish Council was actually the intermediate between the Germans and the Jews of Amsterdam. And this cousin didn't dare go into hiding. And the woman where we were hidden said, "I'll get him for you." So not only did they save us, she got him, and he came to us. The 3 of us were hiding together.
Life in the attic was very difficult.
Wait, tell them how you got there.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't say how you got into hiding. The
No.
pastors.
No, I have to tell that.
Well,
I forgot.
You can't wrestle this thing away.
I forgot. But in Holland, my mother said, you have to be able to work 1 day as a volunteer. That was her religious message to me. I have always been a volunteer 1 day a week. I still do. And so that in Holland, I went and gave from the Dutch government the check for welfare to a couple, among others, who had been unable to work. He had been sick. He used to be a waiter in a hotel, and they had 2 smaller daughters. And they lived on a wide street in Amsterdam. The streetcar went through, and they had an apartment on top of a store, and then came another apartment, and in the attic is where we were. And she said, you go live there, and we will try to save your life. Okay. Now you.
So we lived in the attic here, and life was very difficult because, number one, there was only very little food. We ate sugar beets, we ate tulip bulbs, narcissus bulbs, anything you could scrape together we would eat. And electricity, we had maybe 1 or 2 hours. The last 6 months there was no electricity. And
no heat.
No heat, of course. And the trauma, the pressure was tremendous because only the Germans had cars. And every time you heard a car in the street and the car would stop, we were afraid that we would have a search for hidden people, and then they would have found us. And as I told you before, we had to deliver our radio, but I didn't do it. I put my radio in the ceiling in here, and with strings I manipulated it so that we could listen to the BBC. But we couldn't put a loudspeaker on, that would have given us away. So we listened with earphones. And on one day, on a Wednesday, I think, there was a call from the BBC that there would be a house-to-house search on the next Sunday. And I figured, well, if there's a house-to-house search, I'm sure they'll find us, and we have to do something to save us. And I took a door out of the attic and put it on a swivel under the stairs. And on the door, I put shelves, and on the shelf, I put the well-known junk, glass jars with bolts and with screws, and on the bottom, we put some bags with wood. And when the Germans came, we stood here. And they stayed in the house for about half an hour, looked under all the beds, looked in all the closets, but they didn't find us. And that was a miracle, because into several houses they went with dogs. And if they would have come with a dog, they would have found us.
They would have smelled us.
Yeah, they would have smelled us, and we would have been gone and forgotten. But this way, after half an hour, we came out there, very wet, but alive. And if you ever heard the saying that you hear your heart bounce, it's really true. You can hear your heart bounce. The other pressure was that you couldn't make any noise. We always walked in stocking feet. We never talked to each other. We only whispered to each other, except when those people in between were left. And then we had a little bathroom here, and that was the only time we could flush the toilet. Then we looked out through that window, and there was a yard behind us between two apartment houses. And opposite us was a little balcony, and a darling little girl we saw was born there, stood there in a crib, and then she grew up, and when she was about 2 years old, she played on that balcony, and she crept up on the griddle and fell over, and we were powerless to do anything. We couldn't shout, we couldn't do anything. But that were some of those terrible traumas you had during the war.
Yeah, you forgot to tell that little girl fell to her death, by the way.
I think what you may not have made clear or fully understood, the people who arranged for my parents to go into hiding, who were the couple that were welfare clients of my mother's, were the Peisters on the first floor above a store. Then above them, you see the next level where we put the word Bovens. Those people, that was a couple who lived there the entire 3 years or 2.5 to 3 years that my parents were hidden. They never ever knew that my parents were in hiding in the attic. So my parents could only move when they got a signal from the Peisters that the Bovens in between were gone.
Safe.
Then they could move and cough a little bit and go to the bathroom and flush a toilet. But when the Bovens were there, they could never move. And one of the things I hope you tell them about a little bit is what you did while you were in hiding, how you kept your sanity and what you did.
The three of us sat then upstairs, and when they wanted us downstairs, they would hit the staircase and we would come down. But usually we would sit for at least 3 hours and we would read the same book. And since we speak 4 languages, we thought we would read good novels and not cheap ones. And so we read good novels, talked to each other about it, and then we sometimes acted them out even. We also played bridge with the man downstairs, with our war father. And we also played together upstairs a card game called Skat. And we had one candle, and we put 3 mirrors around it. So then we had 9 candles. We had 6 candles. Reflection.
Maybe with 18.
So we could play cards. We went to bed very early, but what we did was we tried to give the kids who could not go to school some kind of education. They came every morning to us and we gave them some work so that they would have a feeling that they would learn something. We were worried about the kids because they loved to smoke cigarettes and they loved to see in these cafes in Amsterdam where the German soldiers were roaming around. They had cigarettes, and that's where the girls sometimes got cigarettes. And you see, we were worried that something would happen. We were never worried, strangely enough, that they would betray us. It never dawned on us that they would.
That anybody.
That anyone would.
Tell him just for normal.
Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what was happening to their son at this time, because appreciate that when they went into hiding, they gave up their 2.5-year-old boy. They were 29 at the time. And the Dutch Reformed Church, through intermediaries, placed me with a young couple in the city of Haarlem, where the resistance was largely centered. The couple that I went to at that time had no idea who I was. My parents, in the meantime, had no idea where I was, or indeed whether I was alive. So I was placed with this young couple in Haarlem, and their marriage broke up. And when their marriage broke up, I was brought back to the Dutch Reformed Church, which then placed me in a sort of orphanage on the eastern side of the Netherlands, close to the German border. The father of the man who took care of me at first, and his wife, they got to like me a little bit, and they decided that they would take me back from that orphanage and take me to their home and pretend that I was their grandchild. They went on their bicycle, got some special permits to go through some German lines, and they brought me back somehow. They dyed my hair blonde and pretended again that I was their grandchild. I never suffered. I think one of the things that you have to realize that when my parents went into hiding, as indeed anyone, including, of course, the Anne Frank story, is that there is a constant feeling of terror. Every time you hear a car or a truck or hear a siren or hear marching footsteps, it's just a feeling of utter and complete terror because you could be taken away. That kind of thing is sort of hard to translate. But indeed, I never even suffered that because my war father, who took care of me, was a policeman. And he had a German girlfriend, and he owned a half interest in a bar in the red light district in Amsterdam. And through that combination of having a German girlfriend who would always let him know when there would be a raid, and having an interest in a bar in the red light district, he always had enough money to be able to get us food. And when you're young and you grow up on sugar beets and tulip bulbs, you don't know that these aren't terrific things for you. And therefore, I didn't knowingly suffer. These people who took care of me during the war, the mother lived until a few years ago in an old age home, and I saw her many times a year. One of the sons is still living and lives in Amsterdam, and we see them often.
Go
ahead.
You know, I wanted to tell you something that happened during the war. We were sitting in the attic very quietly, never going out. And the strange thing is I got very bad toothache. and I had to get out. You could go out in Amsterdam if you dare to, and then you had to wait. There was no electricity. To wait till about 4 o'clock. Then it would get a little bit darker when it was winter time. And I found in the telephone book a street, which I knew, where lots of dentists lived next to each other. So I just said to my husband and my cousin, I'm going, I can't take it any longer. And so I went with toothache and all, walked through that street, and when I came in, we had people waiting in the waiting room, and I was so afraid I would know someone, but I didn't. Then I came in the office and I said to the doctor, I cannot give you my name. I cannot pay you because I'm hidden and I have no money. Some money, but not enough to pay you. So he said, don't worry about it. So he looked at me and he had to drill a hole in the jaw to get to the root. And his wife was sitting next to him as if she was pumping a sewing machine. And that's how the drill worked. And then when it was over, he said, you have to come back in 2 days. And that's what worried me, because I wonder if I came back, if that would be safe. But I had no other choice. So I came back in 2 days, and instead of being afraid, his wife gave me a package, a care package, with bread and with sugar and with cheese, but not much more. And I was so happy with it. So I went home, he took everything out, what had to be taken out, and I went home and we feasted, the three of us together. After the war, I went to him and I said, I wish I could repay you. And he said no, he didn't want 1 penny. But I don't have to be sorry for him, because he later became a professor of dentistry in Utrecht. Utrecht.
The amazing thing is also Emily went out to see the dentist and there was no street lights. And then you only realized when the moon was out how much light the moon would give. Fire alarm. My brother was a very rebellious type, and he didn't want to stick to those German ordinances. And he always went around without his star. And one day he was picked up and had to show his identity card, and they saw that he was Jewish, and he was sent to concentration camp. He was married to a Catholic girl, and that what saved him. He was sent to a transit camp, and on one day, the camp commandant called 5 people that had mixed marriages and asked them to come to his office, and when they were there, he said, we don't want any more of those little Jewish bastards running around. If you would agree to be castrated, you can go home. And 4 people said, okay, that's fine with us, but my brother said, no, I never would do that. And in the irony, my brother was sent home, and those 4 people were sent on transport and never heard again. You want?
Yeah. I think at this point, I don't know how much time we have, but I'd like to sort of go to the end of the war and mention one thing at the beginning of the war in retrospect, and that's the serendipitous nature of all of this. It's a good word for you. The beginning of the war, when the Germans took over Holland, for the first 10 days or 2 weeks or so, many people were able still to get out. And we, in fact, all of us, together with the grandmother that we spoke about, went to one of the small shipping towns on the coast of the Netherlands, in IJmuiden, and my father had with him a bag of coins at that time. You could purchase your passage by paying coins. Paper money was worthless, but coins were acceptable. and they had arranged for passage, and we came there, and my grandmother had an earache, and I had a toothache, or vice versa, and my parents decided they'd do it another day. And of course, they never got out. I think you heard a little bit about the hiding and so forth. Let's go forward to May 5th, 1945, when the war ended. At that point, of course, I was with my war parents, and my parents, for the first time, got out, and they had to find their son. And why don't you tell that, if you would?
Well, we came out of hiding, and it was yesterday, 53 years ago. And so then we walked to the minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, who said he will bring us to Leo. We walked for about 3/4 of an hour. Well, we had never walked for nearly 3 years, so it wasn't that easy, but we came to Leo, and then his war mother, who became later my great friend.
You had to find out where I was first.
Yeah, but he came with us, and we went to the 3rd floor, and we found Leo. And Leo hadn't slept that night because so many planes went over. So she said, come back in about 3 hours. So we took Leo and walked in the street, and we said to Leo, what is it you want most? And Leo said, I want to have a paper hat, because they had one store open that had paper stuff that you use for party goods. So they had some hats. We stood in line for an hour, and then he got a paper hat, an orange paper hat, because everything in Amsterdam was orange, because the Queen of Holland is the House of Orange. And so we took Leo to our hiding place, where he met us. Well, he met my father and mother-in-law, who had come out of prison and stayed with us. So he met the family for the first time.
My father and mother wound up in prison because the inside of my father's wedding ring, the initials didn't jive with the initials on his identity card. So they went to prison, but they were very lucky because it was towards the end of the war, and there were no more trains going to Europe, to Germany. So they stayed in prison, and on April 20th, they were set free. They had to sign a document that they were treated well and that nobody did them any bodily harm, and then they were let go. And on that day also, for the first time in 2 years, we got bread, because the Swedish Red Cross had arranged to send airplanes to Schiphol, which is the Amsterdam airport, and they were dropping sacks of flowers, and the Red Cross distributed that flour, and a coupon, like I showed you, was announced, coupon number 7, and every person could put one white bread. And we were so enamored with that bread that we took that bread, went to bed, hid under the blanket, and cut it and ate it, because that was for us, that was like really manna from heaven. That was.
So then the war was over, and we got from the Dutch resistance, which was absolutely terrific, we got a house assigned to us. So we had a house, and the only reason we got the house was that we had to have the soup kitchen in that house downstairs come 3 times a day, so that we could use the house, but had to open it up in our neighborhood for the soup kitchen. And we think we had about 40 people every day, 3 times, with a plate and a spoon to eat from the soup kitchen. You know what the soup kitchen gave us? It was an American milk with
Milk powder and biscuits.
and biscuits that the army used. And those biscuits are very good for you. And so we got that. My sister came out of the hospital of Maastricht with her 3 kids, and the Red Cross started an office in the old conservatory in Amsterdam. And the Red Cross is the one that tried to get us together and gave the survivors a chance to know who was yes and who was not alive anymore.
Mag ik eventjes en dan eindig ik het.
Ja.
Oké.
Just a thought about my rescue at the end of the war. My parents came to get me. My father had feet that were swollen to proportions you wouldn't believe. They were like basketballs. He hadn't walked for years, and because of the lack of food, he had an edema on his feet. I didn't recognize my parents. Of course, I was very young when they left, and so it was a process to wean me back to them. But the first thing that happened shortly after that first day is that they took me back to their apartment. And their apartment, so-called, was, of course, the hiding place. And my parents had not had any food to speak of during the last 6 months of the war. It's called the Hunger Winter in Amsterdam. There was nothing, but my parents had a large can of baked beans, which they had saved for the day that they would get their son back. And when they picked me up, they took me to this apartment, and with great ceremony, they opened this can of beans that they had starved for just to preserve it, just for my coming home. And they gave me some of these beans, and I said, ugh, I can't stand beans. Anyway, why don't we stop the story at this? Why don't we stop the story at this moment and ask you all if we could take some questions from you? Do you want to intermediate that? Thank you.
What time is
Thank
it?
you. I know that you have worked very hard with all the teachers to prepare questions. So at this time, I know that the Ullmans have not answered all of your questions, and you may have some. So if you'd like, just raise your hand, we'll call upon you. I'll repeat the question for the Ullmans, and maybe you'll have some answers to questions that you thought about. Yes?
Was it hard growing up without your parents?
Was it hard growing up without your parents?
Well, should we just, maybe we'll...
What was it, Harold?
I didn't know that because for me, these people were effectively my parents. And they were very good to me as far as I know. They were very, very good people. They were terribly religious Dutch Reformed church members. And I asked my war mother after the war, why did you do this? And why would you risk certain death to protect someone like me when you knew, how dangerous it was? And she always said that it was the right thing to do, and she never thought about it. She never got anything for it. This was just out of the goodness of her heart. My parents, by contrast, started out initially paying the pastors for their hiding. And that was one of the difficulties that we have to deal with, is that the people who could afford to go into hiding had a much better chance of surviving, sadly enough, than a lot of people who could not.
That's it.
I had a question. Could you tell us how you knew the war was over and when it was safe to come out of
Now,
hiding?
that's easy.
Oh, that is an easy question. Because the street where we lived was a wide street, and it was May 5th, 1945, and it was 5 o'clock in the morning when we suddenly heard and went downstairs and heard that the German army and the soldiers were walking in the street without any decorations, without any guns, and so we thought, that's it. And it was.
And Amsterdam was liberated by the Canadian Maple Leaf, and hundreds and hundreds of Germans walked through the street, one jeep in the front with 4 soldiers and one jeep in the back with 4 soldiers. That was the occupation force in the first days.
But the other thing that you have to realize is when the war was over, everybody went on the streets.
Yeah.
And there was cheering and screaming and hugging and music and things that just hadn't happened for the last 5 years. It was
Yeah.
just a tremendously joyous occasion. And for me, what was sort of special is that these people who hid us on the street of Amsterdam where I lived, who hid me, always thought that nobody knew that I was a hidden Jewish child. At the end of the war, it turned out everybody on the street knew, and nobody had squealed. Yes, no, sorry.
Becky, you want to go?
How old were you when your parents found you, or the king got rid of it?
At that point,
Two.
no, at the end of the war, I was 6.5. 6 years old.
Doug, you have a question?
Mr. and Mrs. Ullman, when you guys were in hiding, how did you follow your religion, or how did you keep the faith?
This
Let me
is the
just repeat
most
the
difficult question you can ask us, because I don't think that I can say that we were on our knees a lot. But there is not one night still that I don't go to sleep without saying a small prayer for my kids, for my daughters-in-laws also now, because that's what I did. But that's all I dare do, because I didn't want to get too emotionally out of whack. And this is our problem during the war. You have to try to stay, see the humor maybe in life, see the love in life, and not give up, because the fight to live was so strong in us. The fight to find my mother, to find my sister, and most of all to find Leo, of course. I think that's the fight that kept us alive. I can't say anything else.
The short answer.
I never gave up,
But they were not religious
no.
during the war.
We
at
were
this time.
both brought up in very liberal Jewish household. We never went to temple. And the amazing part is that the Dutch Reformed were a very fundamentalist religion. And that is one of the reasons why they took so well care of a lot of Jewish children, because for them, the Jewish people was the chosen people. And they were very strict and very orthodox and very fundamental. But on the other side, we were very tolerant in the Netherlands. And the Pilgrims went to the Netherlands and found a haven there. The Spanish Jews went to the Netherlands and found a haven there. So it was a society with a lot of contradictions.
That's it.
Aaron?
Were you shocked to hear that the war was over, or
Let me-
did you expect it?
Were you shocked to hear that the war was
No,
over?
we expected already a year before, of course, but it didn't happen. No, we were of course elated, and yeah, it was the day that I'll never forget. It was yesterday, 53 years ago.
Mag ik even?
Niet praten meer.
I think the other answer to that, though, is that once the Normandy invasion took place, everybody assumed the war ending was just a matter of months. And it was expected, in fact, to end in the fall of 1944. And it would have ended in Holland at that time had it not been for A Bridge Too Far. If you get a chance to read the book, A Bridge Too Far, what happened was that the Germans massed in a certain area of Holland. They were able to prolong the war for 6 months, and it's during that period that so many people died, including Anne Frank and her sister, for example.
Yeah, you.
No, laat haar maar voor.
Stand up and ask your question.
What was life like for you after the war?
What was life like for you?
What was
after the
life
war?
like for you after the war?
After the war, it was so difficult for us to be in Amsterdam. Not that we got so many of our people back, but we lost so many. So you walk in Amsterdam and you go to houses that are now empty, that used to be your relatives. We lost in Amsterdam about 120 cousins, aunts, uncles, people we loved, friends, and it was so difficult for us to stay there that we decided we go to America and start a new life. And of course, one of the reasons we came here is that we couldn't take it anymore. Niet meer.
Latheimer. Latheimer.
Stand up so we can just hear. I'll repeat your voice. Do
Did
you know what was going on outside while
outside?
it was happening?
While you were hiding.
No.
Well, I told you that I had my radio hidden, but for the last 6 months we had no electricity anymore, so we couldn't listen to the radio. But the Dutch underground not only provided us with coupons so that we could live, but they also printed illegitimate underground papers. And here are 1, 2, 3, 5 of those underground papers. They were printed, the Vrijheid, which means
Liberty.
the liberty, was the Communist Party. The Wegwijzer was the Roman Catholics. Christopher was the fundamentalist right. They all had their own newspapers. But there were 23 parties in Holland. And in 1942, under the pressure of the Germans, they all united to help people to go into hiding. And they succeeded in hiding 15,000 people. That were the people that were saved. Only about 5,000 came back from the concentration camps.
Oké, niet meer, niet meer.
I can't hear that.
How come, why could you not tell the people who lived underneath you that you were hiding in the attic?
Because we didn't want to lose.
I think if you read the story of Anne Frank, the reason that Anne Frank and her family was taken away was that too many people knew about their hiding place. They ran their business underneath their hiding place. They had to feed an awful lot of people. Everyone knew where they were. And I think the conscious decision that my parents took was if they went into hiding, the fewer people that knew, the safer it would be. And that was the essential reason.
Ja. Ja, nee, jij moet je niet mee bemoeien.
When you were in hiding, did you ever think about like just giving up or were you determined to make it through more?
When you were in hiding, did you ever think of just giving up?
Giving up.
Never.
Never, never, never.
You can't
Short
give up
answer.
when you have a child that you want to see and you still hope to see your mother, you still hope to see your sister. That is something that gave me the strength during the war that you cannot give up. And maybe it's the message to you too. When life gets difficult, you cannot give up because then you are lost.
Goed.
Nee, nog één. Er moet nog één.
Besides your family, did you know anybody that survived from the concentration camp?
Yeah, my sister did.
Besides your family, though, did you know anyone who survived?
I know several people who survived the war because there were more people also on that train who survived the war. And those people who survived are some of them that Leo knows because he came out of concentration camp and really started your Anne Frank Institute, right?
Well, Jack. I think Bergen-Belsen, which is where Anne Frank and
Died.
Margot Frank died, was not an extermination camp. And to the extent that people survived the war, those that were in Bergen-Belsen, for example, would be the ones that would have come back to Holland, or some of them, that my parents would have known. But appreciate that before the war, there were some 150,000 Jewish people in Holland. Of those, only about 30,000 survived.
20,000, I think.
Did your sister tell you about some of the experiences you had, she had? Can you tell us some of them?
Did your sister, was she able to tell you of some of the experiences she had?
My sister was a very intellectual, interested person. She studied Latin and Greek at the University of Amsterdam, and she had the quality to be able to express herself, but not very much on paper. So the stories I know from her were the stories she told me after the war, but her children, her 3 children, never ever could talk about it, except if they come to visit us. Then I have one niece who won't even let me go to the bathroom alone, and always the war comes out. But I must say those 3 kids, they are now of course grown, they had a very, very difficult time.
Can you explain what the Dutch underground was?
The Dutch underground started above ground, actually. Holland was the only country that had a general strike against the Germans. And in 1941, the railroad workers went on strike, and the Germans were completely taken back. And they retaliated very cruelly. They picked up 400 people and sent them to concentration camp, and 40 people were shot very close in our neighborhood and were laying there for some day. And then, as I told you before, all those different parties united and tried to help, to work, to sabotage the Germans, to help people that were in the illegal forces, to rescue Allied flyers that were shot down, and they did a tremendous job of good work. And very often the question is asked, why wasn't there more open resistance? Because open resistance sometimes had the completely different effect. The Archbishop of Holland, from the pupil, one day announced, and he said all his priests from the pulpit, announced that all the priests should make a sermon that it was wrong to persecute the Jews, and they did that. And the next day, the German SS raided all the monasteries, it picked out all the converted Jewish people and sent them to concentration camp.
That's it.
Did you ever question your faith or ask why this happened to you?
Did you ever question your faith or ask why did this happen to you?
I don't know what to answer, because my faith was my faith. I mean, you go and you are born with a faith, and I could have never given that up. But I never even questioned that. What I questioned was always, I hope to get out sane, or that I wouldn't be hard, or I wouldn't be mean, because I figured in that case, I hope you understand what I wanted to tell you, I think in that case the Germans would have won.
You have to be tolerant.
And I wanted to be tolerant. I didn't want the Germans to make me into a sour person. I wanted to keep my faith in love and humane, and I wanted my child back, and I didn't want to get out of it so that the Germans would have won. Is that the wrong answer?
No, very good.
Vreselijk moeilijk. God.
When you were in hiding, did the Germans come to look for you on a regular basis, or was it just spontaneous?
When you were in hiding, did the Germans come to look for you on a regular basis, or was
Only
it?
once.
Okay.
Only once did we have what we call
Unannounced, they would-
unannounced razzia, and that is what we feared most. We had once more, when we were still before going to hiding, we had 2 Germans come into our apartment, where at that time we lived with my in-laws and my lovely grandmother. And he wanted to take my grandmother, of all people. And then what I did was, I asked this German man if he liked to have a drink. And he said, yeah. Then I said, I have whiskey, which we saved for the occasion. So I gave him whiskey. It ended up with me putting up his, how do you call that?
Hat.
His hat.
His cap.
Cap. And at the end, we just pushed them out. And it is maybe a week after that that we decided to go into hiding. Too risky.
How did the Germans know that you were Jewish?
Hoe wisten de Duitsers
How did
dat
the
je Joods
Germans
was?
know that you were Jewish?
Yeah. How did the Germans know we were Jewish?
Oh, because Holland was a very well-organized country. And as I told you in the beginning, you had to get identity cards. And every citizen and every birth was registered at a central register. And everyone had to contribute to the churches, no matter what religion. So if you were Jewish, you could contribute to the Jewish community, to the Catholic community, to Dutch Reformed, whatever. And that's how they knew. You were registered as Dutch
Everyone
Reformed,
contributed.
Catholic,
Yeah.
not Jewish, Israelite they would put down.
Israeli.
Israeli. And that's how they knew.
Kijk, wat ze nu vragen.
I have 2 questions.
Let's try the first one first.
Did you get your job back after the war?
Did you get your job back after the war?
Yeah.
Yeah. 1 week after the war, I went to my old firm, and they said, yes, we have to straighten out a little bit. In a few weeks, you can take your job back. And that was one of the reasons, actually, that we immigrated, because my job was a buyer for a department store, and the natural trading for Holland was Germany. But I didn't want to travel to Germany anymore. That was one of the reasons. But I got my job back, and I also got back 3 years of back pay. And that was very generous. We were very happy with that. We had nothing, and we spent it very frugally.
Yeah.
We bought an antique clock, a silver tea service, and 2 Japanese vases. That was it.
It's also the money with which we came to America.
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Doug, one last question?
After thinking of all your experiences in the times of the Holocaust, if you had to change anything that you would have done, would you have changed anything to survive?
If you have to think back on all of your times through the Holocaust, if you would have changed anything that you would have done to survive, what would it have been?
Taking that boat.
Have taken a boat. Yeah.
No, I'm not so sure, because to be in it and to stay in it and to stay around people and to be able to get allowed to get alive out of this, strangely enough, is a kind of accomplishment that I am extremely grateful for. I don't know if you'll understand it, but for that, I'm glad I did it. Stupid answer.
Yeah.
Could you describe what your relationship was with your war parents and the people who hid you after the war, and how long it went on?
You want to say that?
Could you describe your relationship with your war parents after the war and the people who hid you after the war, how that relationship went
That's a
on?
very interesting and difficult question. especially for my parents. For me, it was easy because these were wonderful people, and we maintained a close relationship with them as long as they were alive. For my parents, and I'd like to just talk about this for a second because it's one of the things that's most amazing of all to me. These people, the pastors, without a question, and there is no doubt even for a second, saved my parents' lives. They never betrayed them, and they hid them all that time and kept them alive. Yet, after the war, my parents felt so angry and so demeaned by these people because they were incredibly mean-spirited to my parents, believe it or not, even though they saved their lives, that after the war, they had nothing more to do with them. And to this day, we don't know what happened to the girls, though we've tried to find out, and there was never any meaningful relationship.
Yeah, we went to
No, we went to
their
their funeral. They called us to go to the funeral when he died, and I went because he was on a trip. I went all alone to the funeral. I was the only one there because his kids didn't go. And I said to the funeral director, "Is this the funeral?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Where are the people?" And he said they didn't come. So then I was the only one who interred this man. And then when I came home, I got a call, and they said, "Come to our house because we want you to be with us to have a kind of a strange dinner," which I had. I went to the house, and we had dinner together, and we drank wine to celebrate the father, and that's the last time I saw them. Strange relationship, actually.
We truly thank you for coming. I don't know if all of our students are aware, but the Ullmans came to us today all the way from Long Island in this miserable pouring rain. So we have only the greatest appreciation for you and for coming to us and sharing with us a part of our history that made our lives richer today. So we thank you.